Now, of course, as you guys know, I'm a big fan of emulation and I've covered many emulation topics on the channel over the years, but I wanted to cover this today because the Multi Arcade Machine Emulator, known as MAME, is 25 years old. For those that may have heard the word MAME but are unsure as to what it is, MAME emulates many different arcade machines, from the earliest games like Computer Space, Space Invaders and Pac-Man, all the way up to more modern games, with many thousands of arcade games that are playable, and many that are still not. But let's go back to 1997. Back then, emulation was an emerging but a very popular scene that still very much was in its infancy. But with the rise of the Pentium-class machine from the older 486, computers were getting fast enough to emulate many different game systems. We've covered the NES, Super NES, and even N64 emulation. But MAME perhaps is arguably the most important emulator that was ever released. When I look around at all the consoles and computers that I own, even my cell phone, there is a build of MAME that runs pretty much on everything, just in the same way as Doom runs on everything. And even my Commodore Amiga 1200 from 1992 runs a version of MAME. Not very fast, of course, but it can handle the earlier 8-bit games, but when I upgrade to a faster 060 processor, it opens up the door for 16-bit games to run. And that's one of the many great features about MAME. It never stopped evolving, and it never stopped being developed. There are also some commercial releases that use MAME, and you may not be aware of this, but one recent example is the Capcom Arcade Stadium that released recently for modern consoles, including the Nintendo Switch. And of course, Capcom owns the games, so the approach is, why build your own arcade emulation core when MAME can be licensed and it will do the job for you extremely well. Even the Mr. project that we've covered recently references MAME. Not directly, of course, but its extensive documentation surrounding arcade integrated circuits is pivotal in the advancements of arcade cores. It's been said that MAME's influence and DNA spreads across every single emulator developed after it, and that's hard to argue against. The first version of MAME was released all the way back in 1997. At the time, as mentioned, emulation was an emerging scene in the underground. Some home computers and game consoles were already emulating quite well, especially Z80-based systems, thanks to some really great documentation at the time by the likes of the early pioneers such as Marat Faizullin, who was already developing his own line of emulators for the NES, MSX, Game Boy, and others. But when it comes to emulating an arcade system, where do you even begin? While the thought of emulating a full-size arcade cabinet sounds initially quite daunting, fortunately, earlier arcade games would use the same processors and RAM chips as you would find on home computers. The MOS 6502 or the Zilog Z80, for example, would power early arcade hardware, and the same emulation concepts would apply during traditional interpreted-based emulation. During 1996 and early 1997, different single arcade machine emulators were released, all before MAME. For example, games such as Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, Galaxian, and others. MAME itself first started as a project known as Multipac. Developed by Nicola Salmoria, the goal was to preserve games that used the Pac-Man driver, and in February of 1997, MAME.1 was released, and it only supported 5 games. But by the end of 1997, 0.29 would be the final release of that year, supporting hundreds of arcade games and introducing early Capcom titles such as Gunsmoke, Commando, but as probably the first major milestone of the MAME project after its initial release, it introduced the Motorola 68000 arcade hardware. The earliest MAME release that I could find with source code available was 0.7, which I should mention is the 7th revision after 0.1. Now that may seem obvious, but MAME did have some weirdness with version numbers over the years. For example, 0.7 and 0.70 are 2 completely different releases, so I did want to mention that. Anyway, if we go back and take a look at the 0.7 source code, and if we look at any of the drivers, for example Galaxian or Crazy Kong, you can see even at this early stage, it's extremely well documented. Once new discoveries were made, then the documentation would be updated. Now this may seem trivial to think about, but if you were tasked to build a Galaxian emulator, or maybe you're a hobbyist and wanted to build your own emulation core, before MAME you would need an arcade board access to the ROMs, schematics, and an operator's manual to know the memory addresses and the dip switch settings. MAME drivers effectively keep a journal of all this documentation of the particular machine being emulated in its code and header files. When you dump ROMs from a PCB, you're comparing the checksums to what you have with MAME, not only because they are documented, also because someone has done it before you. Unless of course you have an undumped PCB, but MAME has a team that handles the dumping of arcade boards if you don't have the tools to do it yourself. Now, other interesting things about MAME was it introduced the concept of non-working games to emulation. In other words, games that won't start either because they were unable to be dumped correctly, or there is important missing driver information, or maybe there is some protection circuitry that has still yet to be figured out. But documenting of these non-working drivers is equally as important as documenting the working ones. And if you followed MAME over the years, you may recognize that many earlier non-working games would slowly transition to become working games. As mentioned, MAME's main goal is documentation and preservation. Being able to play arcade games is a nice side effect. And over the years, MAME has had many a milestone that opened up arcade gaming for the masses to enjoy. By the start of 1998, Motorola 68000 support was added to the emulator. This single CPU runs everything from Capcom CPS-1, CPS-2, the SNK Neo Geo, Polygame PGM-1, Early Cave, Toll Plant, Sega System 16, Superscaler, and many other arcade boards. But not everything would run on day one. Many arcade games also contain custom protection against bootlegging. But over the years, MAME developers would work to decrypt many of the protection schemes and bring more arcade games to life. Other milestones would be the introduction of DSP cores, and things like Midway, T and Y unit drivers. This meant that games like Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam would be playable outside of home ports for the first time. MAME Dev's website has a comprehensive list of milestones over the years, and it's worth checking out. Another personal one for me is the Capcom CPS-3 protection, which meant that Street Fighter 3 would be playable in emulation after many years of wondering if it was even possible. In more recent years, MAME's source code was modernized to use C++14, which meant portability on newer systems such as the Raspberry Pi and similar ARM-based devices. As far as my history with MAME, it was mostly as an end user, eagerly awaiting a new version to try out to see what drivers were fixed and what games were added to the latest version. But in later years, I worked on ports of MAME 0.72 to the Xbox 360 and sometime in 2017 over to the Nintendo Switch, strictly as homebrew ports. MAME has always been an incredibly portable set of source code, and the earlier versions, which are far less accurate, can be better suited to lower powered hardware. So for me, MAME has a really kind of big part of my emulation history, and I know many of you out there that are watching this probably have similar stories to tell about your experiences with MAME as well. But thanks for 25 years, MAME. I'm looking forward to the next 25. And if you have a cool story to tell about MAME, or if you were a contributor on the project, or if you're still an active contributor, talk about it in the comments below. I definitely want to hear your stories. I'll really give the comments a read over the next few days and hear what you guys have to say on this. But for now, guys, we are going to leave it here for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to put a like on it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.